Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect. All right. So for those of you that are not familiar, this is BWX. It's our translation editor. But essentially, what we're seeing here, the green is coming from translation memory matches. The blue is coming from Microsoft Translator off the shelf without any training. And the yellow are terms in our glossary, right? So as a translator, for instance, what I'm used to is something comes from the translation memory, and maybe it's a perfect match, like in this case, maybe it's a fuzzy match, and we can go into other kinds of cases as well. But essentially what happens is this feed is coming from the translation memory, right? And essentially, because it's a 101%, as a translator, I would just either would be locked or I would just approve it because it's already in the TM. So language is a living body of knowledge, right? In this example, it's pretty clear. So in what happens here is in the, and I'm going to back translate because not everybody speaks Portuguese. It's my mother tongue, so I would rather play around with this in other languages. It's essentially saying that it's translating enhanced in the translation memory as aumentada, which would literally back translate it as augmented, right? Same Latin roots for augmentation. But let's say, for instance, I'm teaching it differently. So I added to the glossary enhanced as melhorada, which would back translate as improved, right? And enhanced has shades of improvement. I have to decide what I'd like to focus on. Now, if I ask AI to translate this, it's taking into account the de facto knowledge, the 101% match, but it's also taking into account the glossary that I just taught it. And it's suggesting, if I apply the translation, it's suggesting the idea of melhorada, right? And I change it. Now let's say I change this again, just as an example. I decide, okay, in this case, I want to call it, it's going to sound funky, right? But I just want to say superior, okay? So now I taught it at enhanced. I want it to be closer to superior. Let's see what it does here. Oh, actually, let me ask AI to translate again. The key thing here is I want to make sure that everybody understood this, right? So in previous situations, if you had a discrepancy between the translation memory and the glossary, this would be up to the translator to make a decision and solve and iron out. And in this case, the AI is doing that for us, right? So that's one application. The other application is now, let's say, for instance, I make a mistake and I remove the word and I change produtividade to, let's see, I'm just going to change it as the opposite meaning. It detected, translation smells detected a error. So the AI is also, it's acting in two different levels, right? One is at the feed level, which is what we call the generative language engine, which is providing to the translator a feed that makes more sense given the terminology base that we just taught it. And the other is the smells, which is, it's basically saying the translation provided is not accurate and changes the meaning of the original text. Enhanced productivity does not have the same meaning as ocio superior, which means superior idleness or laziness, superior laziness. So I semantically, I violated the meaning of the original sentence and the AI is telling me about it, right? So I want to make sure before, I'm going to stop sharing and get into the discussion. But before I stop sharing, I want to make sure that everybody understood these two core components that are going to guide our conversation. One, the generative language engine and how it works. Two, the translation smells functionality and how it works.
Any questions on that, anybody?
Feel free to put it on the group chat. Feel free to ask us, unmuting yourself. Would love to know. Make sure that everybody understood these two concepts.
Let's see. So far, so good from Melissa and Macarena. It looks like it adds up to the TM. Oh, here's a question from Oscar. Good one. May the translator make the final choice.
Yes, always. Like, let's say, for instance, in here, let's say I'm getting flagged about this, but I say, no, I'm right. You're wrong, AI. If I confirm this, I just made the final choice myself. That's just as an example. Same thing, if I decide to override, like, let's ask AI to translate this sentence. And if I decide to override what the AI is saying, then again, it's my choice. So in any given context, the translator always has the final say, at least. And it's a great question, Oscar, because it's a great example of like a technological decision that changes everything, right? Is this something that's there to help translators, or is this something that's there to have the final say or to monitor, supervise, right? It's depending on how you develop tech, the flavor can be completely different. So great question. And Mohammed is asking if it supports Arabic MSA. Yes, it does. And Macarena is saying, can you ask for better suggestions while using the tool? Yes, you can ask for alternative suggestions as well. Just as an example here, if I click on the AI review button, what it's doing here is requesting. So the translation said was o que torna a VideoWorks especial, and it's suggesting o que torna VideoWorks tão especial, which is like adding the adverb tão emphasizes the specialness of VideoWorks. So it's suggesting an addition that's actually not even present in, like, word for word. You can see that the source doesn't have the concept of so special, right? The source doesn't say what makes VideoWorks so special, but it's implying that, and the AI is picking up on that. So, but again, if I agree, I can implement that, and if I don't, I can choose to ignore it, right? So and the reason why I'm trying to contextualize this, and before I stop sharing, is that we are at the very early stages, in my opinion, of large language models and how they interact with human beings. And there are a few core concepts, right? Most people that I talk to, when they think about AI has been tied to this idea of using the ChatGPT web UI. And that can be really good, but it can also be not that good, cumbersome, copy and pasting text. What happens to privacy? What happens to this? What happens to that? And then, you know, you're not working within a structured environment, right? What we're trying to do is create an environment with a very seamless kind of integration. But it already, even at these very early stages, what I'm showing already kind of changes the nature of translation, because instead of me having to author each and every, and let me pull up an example here in Spanish, for instance, instead of me having to author each and every sentence, when I click on a segment, the AI is learning from the machine translation. In this case, there's nothing in the translation memory, and it's suggesting something that to me makes quite a bit of sense, right? So if I read this in Spanish, perfecto para aquellos que simplemente necesitan traducir cosas de manera simple y efectiva. Not bad. I mean, I don't know, Macarena, you happy with this? You want to change this?
Yeah, I would change it a bit, but it works.
Okay. Okay, but what would you change? Yeah.
I would change aquellos, which is has a gender marked, by quienes, that is non-gender marked.
Okay.
So it would be.
So great example, right? Typically you would do this at the segment level. So you would go in aquellos and change to quienes. I'm going to try to teach it at the glossary level. So now we've added this term to the glossary. And now that we've added it to the glossary, next time we see these things in yellow, we can, like, a good example here is with project and trabajos. If I change right now, for instance, it's saying crea trabajos con unos pocos clics. If I change this to proyectos, and I ask AI to translate this again, now it's using the idea of proyectos en lugar de trabajos. So, but the concept is that the main concept that I want to illustrate is that this requires user behavior change, but it really opens the door for the translator to become not just an author, but a teacher, right? We're teaching the engine. We're showing the engine how we want things to be done, so that we don't have to make so many changes at a segment level, and we can work more at a knowledge management level. So, and that's the core thing that I really want to make sure that we all think about when we talk about specialization versus generalization. It's within this context of AI. How does that change things? And with that, I'm going to stop sharing, and let me make sure that I assign the host to Rodrigo, and ask you, Macarena, I would love to hear your thoughts, and tell us a little bit about your journey too. I know that you have quite an opinion when it comes to specialization versus generalization.
Well, hello, everyone. Yes, well, it was great to see how it works, Gabriel, because I don't think many softwares are using this, or not many people are using this yet, because it's so new that we don't know how it works. So it's very, very new for everyone. But the way you showed it was very clear. And for me, it's like similar to a pen, probably. It's just a tool. It's just a tool, you know, and yeah, it's great, but depending on what hands are using it, it will change the result.
Ooh.
So if it's an expert drawer, this pen can be great and achieve great results. But if it's someone who is just starting and learning how to draw, this same pen is going to achieve different results. So I think with artificial intelligence is more or less the same. It's a tool that, depending on what hands are using it, it's going to achieve different results. And I think, like, when we are generalists or specialists, we can improve our speed. Like, it doesn't matter if we are generalists or specialists, we can translate much more using the artificial intelligence. But what I think, and I'm not sure if you agree, Gabriel, is this is useful in certain kind of contents, many, not all kinds of content. For example, if it's very creative task that you need to maybe transcreate one sentence, like one slogan, then like the human mind is gonna be better, like without the artificial intelligence. But if it's like a user manual that has like plenty of words, and it's very similar to other user manuals, then it's gonna be great, because it's gonna help you like speed up this kind of similar content that you have already translated. So it depends on the content, I think. I don't know what everyone else thinks
do
about
others
this.
do other people in this audience who have worked as Macarena, going from generalist to specialist, what do you think? Do you prefer to be a generalist? Is that a good experience? Or does the specialist help you get better quality, more jobs?
And while people answer, Marina, I think I want to touch on two things. One is answering Macarena. I agree, content type. So we're talking about two different concepts, right? Content type, and also I loved your analogy of like the eye being kind of like a pen, and it changes in the hands of whoever's using it. And again, I think this is where subtlety comes so in hand. In my opinion, I want to see a world, if I can choose, I want to see a world where we humans have added importance, not less importance, added importance. I want to see a world where, and a good example is like, for instance, at the very beginning of GPT 3.5, I was experimenting a lot with content authoring. And at first I was blown away. I was like, oh my God, this is like really coherent. And this is, it really sounds convincing. But the more I used it, the less effective it became. I realized this is not my voice. This is not how I say things. And I actually began to value more my idiosyncrasies, my uniqueness, my own voice. I was like, oh, I do have a voice. And it is important for me to sometimes make mistakes to be human. Anyway, I think that there is, that's just one example, right? It's like, the way we see it as a company, we're not trying to use technology to replace people. We're trying to use technology exactly like you said, like a pen, like something that will make people, and people don't even think about it, but writing is perhaps the biggest piece of technology ever invented by the human civilization, right? It's maybe perhaps the single technology that most changed how our civilization evolved. So when we think about it, we're really thinking about it in that way too. We really want to make sure that it's a tool for us and that we don't become the tools. And in that respect, the way that technology is developed changes everything, right? Because if you're just, let's say, creating a technology that doesn't allow for a translator to teach it, like in your example of changing aquellos to quienes. But the cool thing is that even with machine translation, this is answering your question. With machine translation, I think that then it was very clear cut, with like highly technical, super structured content, okay. But with like anything that was required any level of creativity or any level of sensitivity, you would see horrendous machine translation fails. With AI, though, what I do notice in the AI in BWX is that even with more, like in the good example, like the text that we were working on is a marketing text. It's the homepage of our website, right? But the cool thing is that if you teach it once that you don't want the gender flexion, if you don't want aquellos, you want quienes, every time you have the word who, we are essentially teaching the engine that that's how we want to translate. So it means less grunt work, like less focus on changing things one by one and more about changing things as a whole. And this is where I think it's so important to tie this back to our conversation, right? Teaching, in my opinion, is a skill. It's not everybody is a good teacher. You have people who are, let's say, just as an example, you can have someone who plays soccer incredibly well, doesn't mean that they're going to be able to teach a kid to play soccer, right? It's two different skills. You can be very good at something, not necessarily be a good teacher. So one of the provocations I want to offer is that in the world that we're moving into, it's going to be even more important for us to be generalists, because it doesn't matter if, let's say, just as an example, right? Let's say I'm specialized in nuclear physics. Okay. I'm not going to be working alone anymore. I'm going to be working with an AI companion, whether in BWX, whether in another tool. And my productivity is going to be directly correlated with how good a teacher am I. If I'm a good teacher, and this is a great example, right? If both of us are translating, you and I, we're translating the same thing, and you go in every segment, and every time there's a word aquellos, you manually change that to quienes, and I go once to who, and I add it to the glossary, and I don't have to do that 100 times like you did, I'm going to make more money than you. I'm going to turn in my translation sooner than you. I'm going to be maybe even translate better because my brain isn't going to be occupied by this pronoun flexion. I'm going to have more bandwidth to think about, how does this sound? Do I like this? Do I not like this? And so on. So I think there's a conundrum that we're kind of working with, which is our world, in my opinion, privileges specialists, right? If you have a PhD in something and you're very, very, let's say one of the two people in the world who understand something, you're an authority in that matter. You're going to be able to make your time be worth your while. You're going to decide who and how you work with. So there is a strong sense of privileging and encouraging specialization. In our field, when it comes to translation, specialization creates a problem, which is number one, it'll take you a lot longer to maybe generate a client portfolio. If all I do is nuclear physics, I'm going to maybe have to work with 10, 20, 30 different clients to have enough workload in nuclear physics to support me. If I'm a generalist, maybe I'll do a little bit of nuclear physics, a little bit of HR, a little bit of marketing, a little bit of, I'll be able to dabble in different things. But this is something that I do have a question for everybody here, because I would love to know everybody's opinion. In my opinion, so far, I've noticed that large language models are incredible bullshitting machines. They're very good at bullshitting. They're very good at pretending to be much better than they are at something. So just as an example, if I ask the AI to give me a template of an NDA, it'll give me a template of an NDA, and it'll sound perfectly written by an attorney. But if an attorney looks at it, they'll be like, no, dude, you're missing a key clause here. There's an inconsistency there. And and maybe they'll tie it back to my use case and say, no, this is really bad. You're at risk here for some reason. But for me, I'm not an attorney. I'm not a specialist. It's good enough to bullshit. So my question to everybody is, do you think that our role will evolve towards bullshit detectors? And in that sense, only specialists will survive? Or do you think our role is going to evolve more towards being teachers? And as teachers, that's a trait that privileges generalist thinking, right? Because as a teacher, for instance, you need to know a bit. You need to know a lot about human behavior. You need to know a lot about psychology, pedagogy. You need to know about the subject matter itself, right? A pre-requirement to being a good teacher is a generalist framework. So I'd love to hear everybody's idea on this. Are we going to reduce ourselves to becoming bullshit detectors, or are we going to become masters of these models, or is it both? I don't know, but I do believe, based on my own biases, I like teaching. I like working with people. I like working with models. I like dialogue. I like this. It makes me more fulfilled. If you reduce my role as a CO to a bullshit detector, I'm not going to like my work that much anymore. And at the same time, the way I'm thinking about it is I want to make sure we build technology that creates more emphasis in the former than the latter. So I'm getting a few interesting topics here. So
I was just going to suggest Oscar had already put a comment believing specialization is helpful to make a difference in the market. So consider what Gabriel just said about the generalization. Oscar, what do you think?
So here I have a question while Oscar answers. We have a question from Genevieve. Provocating question: if teaching AI requires specific skills and not everybody has those skills, would you consider paying higher rates for teaching your AI? That's a great question. That's an amazing question. And that leads, again, I opened up by saying, I think we have a pretty good idea of what a lot of our problems are. I don't think we have a clue, to be perfectly honest, on how we are supposed to solve them. So the question Genevieve brings up, I think, touches exactly the wound. As you change the role of the translator from author to teacher, how do you compensate for that work? It's not that clear. Do you compensate per time? Do you compensate per effort? Do you compensate for words? Definitely words don't seem to matter anymore that much. My opinion is that we have no idea how to compensate in this new scenario. And if I were to say I have an idea, I'd be lying, because it's not just about me. I can have an idea, but you need the entire industry to be okay with this idea. This means clients are happy with this idea. This means that translators are happy with this idea. That means that people are making enough money with this idea. So I love the question, Genevieve. I don't have an answer, but I do know that it's definitely not going to be a log file. That I know that much. I don't know exactly what it's going to look like, but it's definitely not going to be a log file. I hope that helps. But I do think that the key thing really is all of us have to be able to make a living, a good living, when all of this is implemented fair and square. So go ahead, Oscar.
Thank you, Gabriel. Muito obrigado. And it's a pleasure to be here. I watched Gabriel present SDL Travels many years ago in São Paulo, so this has been a gap of so many years, and I've seen this technology grow. And as a journalist, what I can tell you is that if you can't be a specialist, at least know the techniques and know the ways to ask the right questions and to research and look for the right information. because even a teacher needs to make decisions, and the teacher needs to be as sure as possible of how to evaluate and how to decide. What happened to me as a journalist many times is that I can be a subject in a specialist, a subject specialist in one or two fields, but I cannot be a specialist in everything I do. So as a teacher, when teaching machines or when teaching people or when making editorial decisions, if I'm a specialist, it's okay, it's very good because I know the subject very well. But if I am not a specialist in that subject, in whatever I'm working on, and that happens most of the time because it's difficult to work only on a niche and survive, right? What I need to know is, how do I research? What websites in the internet are the right ones, or what kind of language uses are the right ones to validate one option or another? Where do I find experts, people, actual people that can answer me some questions if I still have doubts? And that's a strategy for survival. If you can be a specialist, okay, best case scenario. If you cannot be a specialist, be like a journalist, asking the right questions to the right people, going to the right sources, and that's what's gonna help you, and that's what's gonna make you survive. Otherwise, probably you will be too narrow in your way as a translator, and it will be more and more difficult to make a living. That's my take. So back to you.
Well, I agree with Oscar. I think it definitely has to do with knowing how to research, how to source informations, what's feasible, what's not feasible. But I think just going back to the idea of DEI, right? I think the key thing is whether in a perfect world, specialists are always rewarded, right? There's always more work, more valuable work for a specialist. That's just the supply and demand, right? If you're a specialist, by definition, that means that you're working with scarcity. That means that you're working in a place where there are less people operating. If there are less people operating, you can charge more. If you can charge more, you can do better. The challenge there is the world isn't perfect. You don't have like a perfect economic marketplace, for instance. So you have to navigate through the imperfections. Number one, for instance, finding people who want to hire you for that specialty. So that by itself, like economic imperfections, naturally create a situation where you don't have a clear-cut situation where being a specialist is better. So that's number one. Number two, with AI, like I said, teaching becomes, in my opinion, everybody who wants to have some kind of relevance will have to understand more of teaching. Less of authoring, more of teaching. That's my personal belief. Maybe I'm wrong, but I do believe that we're moving towards a place where it's going to be more about teaching, less about authoring. The example that I was giving Macarena, if I teach the machine once, whereas Macarena has to make the same change 100 times, I'm going to produce more and I'm going to make more than Macarena will make, right? So the provocation that I make is, and that's one provocation. The other provocation is when it comes to content, because we're moving into a world with hyper content authoring. By that I mean it's already happening. I mean, let's say you don't see necessarily anymore a single page on a website or 5 pages. You see websites with thousands and thousands and thousands of pages, each catered to a very specifically buyer journey, to a very specific demographic. Now I want to sell my product to a 10-year-old. Now I want to sell my product to a 30-year-old, to a male, to a female, to any kind of demographic combination that I believe is important. And content is going in the direction of hyper authoring, right? So there's a lot more in that sense. Again, it's no longer good enough to write, let's say, a pharmaceutical description if only a pharmacist understands that. You need to write it in a way so that it's technically correct, technically accurate, but also accessible. So the more you move into a world of it where accessibility is a thing, which it is, it's a huge thing, the generalization becomes much more important, because not only do you have to know the subject matter, but you also need to be a great writer. Not only do you have to be a great writer, but you have to be a great listener. Not only do you have to be a great listener, but you also have to be great at other things too. And in my opinion, the whole advent of AI just further emphasizes, and like we were contextualizing, the need to be able to teach, the need to be able to learn. And we have a comment here from Milena saying, being a teacher to AI in a broader sense means also transfer your bias to it. How would you tackle this potential issue? That's a great question. I don't think it's tackleable. And let me see here. And in my previous example, I don't know if you remember when I shared my screen, but it was showing, we were showing one example of translation smells was picking up, I briefly glanced over it, but our AI already, when we integrate with GPT 3.5, we're able to pick up on gender bias, for instance. That's one form of bias, right? But the problem is that bias is typically not a universal thing. What's biased for me may not be biased for Macarena. What's biased for Rodrigo may not be biased for Oscar, and so on. So as far as transferring bias goes, it's really that's where, in my opinion, that's where the responsibility of the author goes in. And that's where the design of BWX goes in. So let's say, for instance, with machine translation engines and training machine translation engines, you're training the engine as a whole, and you're using that engine for maybe hundreds or thousands of people are going to be using that engine. In that case, if you introduce bias in that engine, and let's go back to Macarena's example, let's say that I teach the engine to use aquellos and instead of quienes, I'm introducing gender bias into the training model, and thousands of people who use that machine translation are going to be fed that bias. In our model, we're working with micro-learning environments. So let's say Macarena teaches her engine that she wants, instead of aquellos, she wants quienes, and I do not teach my engine that. That means Macarena's engine is going to remember that. My engine is not going to remember that. So in my opinion, bias is a huge deal in AI when you're talking about large models where everybody is, where you have a large collective of people that are drinking from that same fountain, right? If you have bias there, we're as a civilization, and there's definitely a lot of bias there, but that's a big problem for us, right? If you're like biasing towards a certain kinds of people, biasing against other kinds of people, that's terrible, horrible. And that's the challenge that we have with these very large models, is that everybody's drinking from the same fountain. So bias becomes a very big problem. In our model, what we're trying to do is create these micro fountains so that you can be in control of that bias. And you can change it according, like in the example we said, Macarena can go ahead and remove the gender flexion there and said, okay, I want to teach my engine that it's quienes, not aquellos. And Macarena's engine is going to remember that. My engine is not going to know that. Whether or not, for instance, and how we compartmentalize information is very flexible in BWX because of the concept of organizational units. So if Macarena and I were working together in the same organizational unit, let's say we're working together in a client, we're sharing knowledge, then we're working towards shaping the bias of that particular fountain. Now, if Macarena is working on her projects and I'm working on my projects, completely different thing. Then Macarena will teach her model her way, I will teach my model my way. I hope that helps with the question, but again, great question, Milena, I really appreciate that. And I see a question from Ben, same person, I can't trust the machine. Totally understand. Let's say teaching artificial monkeys is putting oneself out of work unless you're on a retainer, but I say retainer plus royalties. I can understand. I think there is a lot of doubt, fear, skepticism, and I'm not saying unwarranted. I mean, who knows what the future is going to be? But I think I was talking to Macarena last week about this, and I think to me it's very clear that it's when you have something new, you can resist it and pretend it's not there. And I see a lot of people doing that. It's like, I'm just going to pretend AI is not there and I'm going to continue doing my work my way. And until someone forces me, I'm not going to change. That's basically one potential reaction towards change. Another potential reaction is going full local on it and yeah, this is going to change the world, it's all great, and drinking the Kool-Aid. Those are the two extremes. And then you have somewhere in the middle, which is where I believe is a healthier part of the spectrum, which is understanding, okay, what are the upsides, what are the downsides, how can I use it to my benefit, and answering Ben's question, how do I continue to be valuable, and how do I continue to make a really good living based on this? Because depending on how we work and as a community, we can see an outcome where everybody here is making more money, let's say 5 years on the road, and we can see an outcome where 5 years on the road, we're all making significantly less money. And it's all about how we shape the technology, how we shape our roles, how we shape the entire idea of translation. And that's what's in check right now. It's way beyond generalization and specialization. The question is, who are we? What's our role? How are we going to work together to figure this out? And it's not easy. So, but I'd love to hear your thoughts, Macarena. I know that we've discussed this.
Well, I think Genevieve said something. Let me see if I can find it again.
Provocating question.
Yeah, no. It was a different one. But it was about like agencies trying to pay us less because we are using artificial intelligence. But I think like there is everything on the market, people who specialize, people who don't specialize, agencies who are aiming at speed and like low price, and agencies that are aiming at better quality, better prices, like, you know, there's everything on the spectrum. And I think artificial intelligence is just one more tool that comes into the game, just like term bases, translation memories, the different softwares we can use to translate. So I don't think like it's gonna make a huge change. Like we are still going to be human translators using technological tools. Like way before, translators used to work with pen and paper and physical dictionaries. And then the computers came in, the digital dictionaries came in, the translation softwares came in, and we are still here translating, super alive. So I think that it's just gonna be one more technological step forward, but the general industry will stay more or less the same, and the spectrum will stay more or less the same. So for me, specializing is great because you can connect with clients and projects that you really connect with and align with. But as Jessica was saying, she likes being a generalist because she can learn from different topics and subject areas, which is great. Like her mind is always learning something new. So I think there's still going to be room for everyone, and artificial intelligence will just be a new tool we can learn how to use and start leveraging, just like we do with translation memories.
I agree, Macarena, with what you're saying in some ways, but I also not so sure things are going to remain the same. I think a lot of people are imagining that this is not that different with what happened with machine translation. And going back to Genevieve's question, if agencies continue putting pressure on rates, we're going to become more or less bad bullshit detectors. Agree 100%. There's a lot of economic pressure on this, right? Let's look at machine translation. What happened, right? Even before machine translation was where it is now, which is, like I said, for technical content, it can produce pretty interesting results. But I think what I saw in the industry in general was translators getting pre-translated content and saying, you know, now you have to do the same work, but for less, because I'm giving you a pre-translation and so on. There was very little concern, in my opinion, over how much work that took, how much headache that created. There was a disconnect between this is the translation machine output, now do the human work. What we're seeing with AI, in my opinion, is the opportunity to mesh those things together in a much more seamless kind of interaction. So the idea is with a good AI feed, not only do you get a better feed, but you get a dialogue happening between, and I'm not saying a dialogue via prompts, I'm seeing a dialogue between, like, adding a term to the glossary. That's a conversation now. I'm adding a term. What do you do with that? You're learning in runtime. You're giving me something new. I'm changing the term, teaching you again, reteaching, and so on. So there's this continuous conversation in terms of knowledge management going on. And in my opinion, what's really interesting as far as a paradigm goes is, this is a great example, right? AI, if it becomes, let's say, just a tool to make us all do a lot more for a lot less, which is how a lot of people will look at it, is it's just an opportunity, less for more. That's basically, if you look at, executive level decisions at major corporations in the world, that's what it is. Less for more, I'm on board. I don't care what it does. I don't care what it is. Less for more is good. I think that on another hand, right? So this is a scenario where it gets applied onto us. This is the technology, do less for more, and take it or leave it, right? And this is a scenario of pressure. I want to propose a different scenario, a scenario where this is a tool built for translators, thinking of translators, mental health, productivity, translation quality, so that you can do more for less. If you can do more for less, that means you're going to make more, and it's going to be better. So again, the question is, who holds the power, right? Are you in the position where you're going to just be a tool, this downstream user, like content is going to be flushed to you and you're going to take it or not and have to output more for less? Or are you in the position of actually controlling your environment, teaching your engine, working with it so that you can produce more for less? And if you can produce more for less, then the power resides in those who can do that, not in those who are forcing. That upper hand is lost. So I don't know if you agree or disagree, Jean-Pierre, but I really see that there's a key thing that, like, what we're seeing as a paradigm shift is translators don't have to be treated as vendors or as workforce. Translators can be seen and treated as artists, as content caretakers, as people who have a final say on things that are so important and so valuable to us as a society. So there are two different scenarios. We can become completely commoditized and run over by the technology, or we can use the technology to become even more valuable, more important, more productive, and so on. So that's let's see here. Those are my trains of thoughts. And Oscar saying back to pen and paper, it is in many ways that is what I'm proposing. Sure, through technology, but emphasizing and highlighting a lot more the human aspect, the creative aspect, the fine decision-making aspect, the curatorship aspect that's going to be necessary. Because, like people have said here, for instance, like, there's crazy amount of bias, there's crazy amount of challenges, there's crazy amount of things that are going to require us as a group to come together and figure out solutions. But I've been saying way too much. Macarena, Marina, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
So this compensation idea has been picked up a few times here. And so when you're saying you can do more for less, that's an output kind of advantage. And then a few of you have discussed, including Oscar, Genevieve, Macarena. What would you say, Macarena, just kind of taking all of these conversations, and you were saying rates and amount of content, and I guess you could say efficiencies and volume and all that. Do you have a response to that in your experience?
Sorry. First of all, Mohammed is raising his hand.
Go ahead, please.
And then I wasn't sure of the question, but yeah, if Mohammed wants to add something, yeah, that's good for me.
Go ahead.
Yes, hello everyone, and my really take on this, it's really that we really need, as a human translators, to get rid of all of those painstaking works, but we don't really have to neglect or to forget that we are the ones who have created those machines. So we are the one like in charge. Yes, it's going to be helpful in the technical and so what field, but when it comes to creation, we could not really deal with that, especially if we're having all those cultural nuances. For instance, if all of the European like culture says it warms my heart, in the Arab world, it's definitely the opposite. It colds my heart. So those machines could not even like with that. So we have to use them in technical field, but they never can be taught culture. So this is the main point, and thank you all for allowing me this.
Well, thank you, Mohammed. I mean, I agree. There's a big point in exactly what you said. We created these machines, and I think just tying this to Marta's comments, because Marta is saying we're talking about the road the translation industry is going to take as if we translators had any real agency to control its development. And I said other revolutions within the industry may have not erased the role of the translator, but I think we can all agree that the pay is getting shittier by the day, just to mention one of our struggles. I don't think that AI revolution is going to grow our paychecks at all. P.S. I actually love AI, embraced it, and have upskilled myself in the field, but the outlook is not great, at least for common language pairs. Perhaps. I tend to disagree. My opinion is that it really is a matter, going to Mohammed's comment, of agency, and what Macarena is saying as well. I think it's a matter of how we as a collective, how understand what our role in this is, how we develop the technology, and how we take care of it. So again, a great example is, if just to illustrate it perfectly, right? Let's say you get a job and you're being paid by log file, and translation agency sends you a job or client sends you a job, but you're yourself using the AI, you're in BWX and you're using the AI, and you're producing the same job that took you maybe 3 hours to do in the past. Now you're doing it in 1 hour. What did you just do? You multiplied your pay by 3. So that's one example. The other situation is like the machine translation situation, where you're going to be forced to work in an AI driven environment, and they're going to say, well, you know what? Now I expect you to output, instead of 2,000 words today, I want 6, and you're going to be paid the same. So those are two different paradigms. One paradigm is where you take charge of the engine, you take charge of the production conditions, you take charge over being the teacher. And the other one is where you're working, you're allowing, you're thinking of yourself just as a peg in this much bigger wheel. And I don't think it's easy to move towards this, in this place of empowerment that I'm suggesting, but I do think it's possible, because I do think that the role, like I'm saying, what I'm suggesting is, in this conversation between specialization and generalization, based on the comments on bias and other things we're seeing, our role as a translator evolved from just reauthoring a single piece of text to actually teaching an entire corpus of language, to actually molding an entire engine. So I have an easy way to argue that the work itself is worth a lot more. The question is, how can we show this to the people who are paying for this, to clients, to large corporations? How can we show this, that the work is actually so much more valuable? And that's why, in my opinion, it's so important for us to work together as a collective and not just operate as individuals. So, but those were my 2 cents for today. I know we're running out of time. I don't know, Macarena, Marina, if you want to add anything.
I think it was awesome to have everybody inputting the questions in the chat, and people, and it's excellent how you've asked the question in the chat, Macarena, about is someone using AI in their jobs currently? And so we see Ligia very much using it. They're still learning about it. So I think we're going to keep having these conversations, keep coming back to these webinars, everybody. We're going to just keep pulling this apart and examining it, and teasing it a little bit and learning from each other. So it's wonderful to have you all. Macarena?
Yeah, I think it's great what Gabriel said at the beginning, that as an industry or as service providers, it's great that we join efforts and we start talking about this as a group, as a community, and yeah, sharing ideas and maybe becoming stronger as a community. That's great, like not being individual translators who work behind the computers and don't know each other. So it's great to have group discussions, and it was great reading everyone's input.
Absolutely. Looks like we're at time. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much. Great seeing everybody. Look forward to the next webinar and really appreciate everybody's time. Thank you.
Take care, everybody.